Welcome to the Rich Lieberman Media Pulse. This is Saturday, and I wanted to talk to you about people that I regard, and many of you do too, but these are my personal favorites. And this has to do with sports talk radio. And these individuals, they did more than inform. They entertained, they were compelling, they were real, they were interesting because they didn't try or fake to be interesting. They were genuinely people that you felt you wanted to listen to because of their own individual style. And they weren't always great. They were flawed. And many a times their flaws were what made them so compelling and interesting and quite frankly as a sense of humor that they possess, which some of them didn't even know it. I'm talking a lot about certain people. There's people I'm going to leave out, but these are people that come to my mind, and that is first uh, Pete Franklin, who was a Cleveland guy, East Coast, came to the Bay Area in I believe, the late '90s, and worked at KMBR. Pete Franklin, who some regard as the inventor of real sports talk radio. And then we have Ralph Barbieri, a literally a magazine writer. He worked for Sport Magazine, which he often alluded to on his shows. And Ralph was unique. I'll get into that in a second because some of his biggest flaws and negativities, well, they were negativities at the time, were his best attributes. And then Monty Stickles, who was clumsy and awkward and funny and irreverent. You talk about a character, sometimes on the bad side, but all the while, very much you wanted to listen. At least I did. And everything that Monty discussed, a little bit edgy, sometimes not by design, by default, but you listened. And I on the periphery, I'll add Gary Radnich, who was really good early on, and he kind of mailed it in, so to speak. But people like that. But let's start at the beginning. Um, let's start with Pete Franklin. Um, and I had heard Pete Franklin. He came to KMBR from Cleveland, and some say he was the forefront is to talk radio, sports talk radio, as an everyday, ingredient on radio. And I loved the fact that he was edgy often. It was shtick. A lot of it was shtick, but it was funny, right? It was very funny and humorous. And, they put him solo, then they teamed him with that. Never mind. Didn't work. He was much better, and he could carry a program, was Pete Franklin. And he had that East Coast, you know, style technique, which a lot of people didn't like. But first off, he was very knowledgeable. And, he had that gumption, that sort of East Coast pizzazz. A lot of people didn't like it, but they still listened, right? That's a clue. He was funny, irreverent, and oftentimes when he did the shtick, and some of it was shtick, where he'd cut callers off and call him a bozo or a buttonhead or whatever, fill in the blank, you know. But Pete Franklin was terrific. And he again, I said he was very knowledgeable. He knew his sports, particularly basketball and football, and of course he knew all the sports, hockey, you name it, baseball, that kind of a thing. So had a very successful one. A few years back, Pete died, but he was at the forefront of sports talk radio nationally. And when he came out to San Francisco, he was terrific. Had a great repertoire, kind of a thing. Um, what was I going to say about Pete? Oh yeah. So Pete, and it was different, and it was somewhat. It may have been too East Coast for some, but it worked no matter what, right? So you listened, you kind of thought, my God, this guy is funny or he's crazy or obnoxious, all the while still listening, right? And you had a sense of what was taking place. He set the tone very evidently every day, right? Okay, Barbieri. From day one, a lot of people had issues with Ralph, myself included. And I knew Ralph pretty well, pretty well. And he had some issues in life. He often talked about the time when he was a sports writer for Sport Magazine and drifted on to KNBR as like a part-time weekend disc jockey. That's when at KNBR they were playing, music. And he morphed into a part-time radio host and he did news talk. He spent time at KNBR, then he went over to KGO, came back to KNBR, and started doing sports phone, filled in fact, replaced Dave Newhouse. Many of you remember was one of the original hosts of Sports Phone 68. And that was when KNBR was a real sports station. And Ralph had that edgy, irksome, annoying, very diminutive, fill in the blank, your own adjectives. He was compelling. And many times when he was awkward, when he would sound, that's why they called him the Razor, because they had the obnoxious voice, used to talk like this, right? Well, that was Ralph. And it it didn't always work well, but one of his greatest virtues was one of his worst virtues in the fact that he had the voice. He often talked about residual subject matter that had nothing to do with sports. Years and years after doing his sports talk duties, what did he talk about a lot? One of the most compelling stories of our lifetime, the OJ murder trial. And he talked about that. And those of you that know what I'm speaking of, Ralph had his opinions about OJ, about everything. That's what made him so interesting to listen to because he was real, a bit flawed, a bit, sort of not the greatest voice. But again, you listened, you kvetched, you griped, you said a few things, probably swore a little like, what the is this guy talking about? Ah! And Ralph had you, right? And I always thought he was great solo, but then they paired him with this guy, Tom Tolbert, who's around today, and it was okay. But I liked Ralph solo because he'd branch off everywhere: politics, culture, legal. I mentioned OJ, sports, of course. And he was a diehard Giants fan. And he made it known to you and everybody else that he was a Giants fan. So we'd get into these long dissertations. And, when they had guests, and Ralph would interview Brian Sabian, the one-time GM of the Giants, he would kvetch and he'd make it known. And Sabian would fight back, and they'd all get into almost like it was radio. They were performing, or at least Ralph was, about certain things. And he'd go off topic, and it was funny. And, at the end, it got sort of lousy because Ralph was having health issues. He, had been a demon of certain vices that he, fortunately, at that time, that he gave up on. And, I can't believe it's been, God, 14 years. April of 2012, they parted ways. They fired Barbieri, they being Cumulus. And then he got back at them when he reached a settlement deal with Cumulus and got quite a bit of money, I may add. But he didn't perform. That was Ralph Barbieri. People forget that. They thought he was doing shtick. No, no. And he'd talk about the pizza. And, he had a really famous cat. He adored cats, right? And of course, he raised a son that he talked about often in his monologues. I mean, there were those who couldn't stand him, myself included, but you still wanted to listen. And that's the name of the game, right? And he certainly provided a lot of ammo to people who thought he was a complete, asshole. But interesting stories. Sometimes he went overboard, which only heightened the interest and other side, the anxiety. But again, Very, very, very important. You listen, and they got rid of him some bullshit. Oh, he used to show up a minute late or a minute early on his 3 o'clock show. What was it, 2:59, or sometimes Tolbert would do the opening intro and Ralph would just suddenly come onto the microphone out of nowhere. Bottom line is this, folks, it was business. The ratings cooked. And Ralph was great. He really was. And still, it was their way of trying to get out from under him. And he was a high paid guy, you know. And then, he developed a disease, which he talked about, an affliction, Parkinson's. And I remember a big, big article in the Chronicle written by Scott Osler, who was a frequent guest on his show in December of the prior year. I believe that, yeah, December of 2011. And then it came out that Ralph had the affliction, the medical condition, early onset Parkinson's, which some said, and may have been accurate, that it was a planned strategy for him to let it be known that he was dealing with early onset Parkinson's. Anyway, they still fired him. They parted ways in April 2012, but Ralph got a pretty good chunk of change, millions from Cumulus. Anyway, Ralph was a very compelling voice, not only KNBR, he worked at KGO, but not as long as his tenure at KNBR. And KGO, he talked about news, everything. He had quite an opinion, and that was Ralph Barbieri. Monty Stickles was an out-and-out character, former football player, Notre Dame. He played for the 49ers. He did the morning sports, sometimes afternoon sports, did commentary on the radio for Cal football and the Oakland Raiders, worked with Bill King. So Monty was all around. He had player pedigree because he was a, very famous football player at Notre Dame. And then, of course, played for the 49ers. And, I used to listen to him, and I was in love with his sports reporting because it was not only reporting and scores and all that, he also did commentary. And he was a character, not always on the good side, sometimes on the sad side. I once watched Monty, and this was a really sad situation, but it was funny at the time. He threw a chair in the Oakland Coliseum press box. And I can laugh now because it not only hit the chair, I'm not going to mention who it was targeted for. It missed its target, the chair, but it was Monty. And Monty was also famous for interviewing Frank Robinson. This is the early 80s when Frank Robinson was the manager for the Giants, and they got into a on-air argument. And I think somebody out there has the tape. I'll try to get it, maybe play it. But it was hysterical. Frank Robinson and Monty Stickles going at it. One of the funniest, unintentional, I may add, things. And you didn't mess with Frank Robinson, those of you who know that story. And then Monty was not exactly a day at the beach either. But anyway, those were compelling characters and quite interesting and real people that made sports talk radio enjoyable and appointment radio almost, as opposed to some of the charades they have today on what they regard as sports talk radio. These are just hacks. Nobody has any kind of indelible nature characteristic that you want to know about because they all perform. They're all trying to be something. They're displaying a personality that is not of them. And that's why I have all these sound effects and shit like that, because they can't just converse. They can't talk. They have to rely on gimmicks, as I've often written about or alluded to. It's a very benign, uninteresting, untalented gobbledygook of goop and gop and whatever you want. It's not funny. It's not original. you have to be a character in some regards. You have to show, and I'm not talking about jumping up and down and screaming and yelling and acting like a buffoon. You didn't have to do that. I was going to say back then. It's not that long ago. We're talking about 10, 20 years ago. But most of all, these were genuine people. And sometimes not the best situations. Sometimes these were very flawed individuals. But because they were so compelling to listen to, their personal flaws was worth the price of admission. You were intrigued. You didn't have to wait for gimmicks and crap and morning personalities trying to be something other and rehearsing staged conversations. Half these guys, not half, almost all of them, they don't know compelling. They don't know genuineness. They don't know any of that. They rely on gimmicks and this false kind of presentation. It's not funny. It's not original. It certainly isn't creative. Hey, you've been listening and watching me, Rich Lieberman, on the Bay Area Media Pulse. It is Saturday. I hope you enjoyed today's broadcast. Please tell your friends and enemies, your priests, your rabbis, your plumbers, doctors, whatever you want about my channel. Please subscribe. And if you can, folks, please make a donation so that I can continue to pay my expenses and give you the unique broadcasts straight from the heart that you will not get anywhere else. We'll see you later.